This wasn't a scam hidden in the shadows. It didn't happen in back alleys or anonymous websites. It happened in boardrooms, hospitals, universities, and some of the most powerful institutions in America. For years, some of the smartest people in the world defended a technology that didn't work, invested hundreds of millions into a lie, and punished anyone who asked the wrong questions. This is not just the story of Elizabeth Holmes. This is the story of how an entire system learned to reward belief over truth, confidence over evidence, and vision over reality. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why scandals like this don't end. They evolved. Elizabeth Holmes didn't look like a criminal. She didn't act like one either. She spoke softly, dressed deliberately, lowered her voice to sound authoritative, and repeated a single mission again and again. She was going to change the world. She claimed her company, Theranos, could run hundreds of medical tests from a single drop of blood. No needles, no labs, no delays. Just revolutionary technology that would save lives. And that promise was intoxicating. Not because it was proven, but because it sounded inevitable. In Silicon Valley, inevitability is more valuable than truth. From the outside, the idea already sounded impossible. Medical experts raised concerns early. Engineers questioned the physics. Scientists said the math didn't add up. But inside the Theranos bubble, none of that mattered. Because Theranos wasn't selling a working product, it was selling a future. And in the startup world, the future is often treated as evidence. This is where the first psychological loop opens. Investors are trained to fear one thing above all else: missing the next big thing. Nobody wants to be the person who said no to Apple, no to Google, no to Amazon. So when someone arrives promising to be the next Steve Jobs, backed by confidence, charisma, and a compelling story, skepticism becomes a liability. Questioning the vision doesn't make you careful. It makes you look outdated. And that fear silences more doubts than any threat ever could. Theranos mastered this dynamic. The company surrounded itself with powerful names, former generals, politicians, and executives whose presence alone signaled legitimacy. These people didn't understand the technology. They didn't need to. Their role wasn't to verify. It was to reassure. Their reputations became armor. And once that armor was in place, questioning Theranos meant questioning everyone associated with it. That's a fight most people weren't willing to pick. Inside the company, reality looked very different. The technology failed constantly. Machines produced inaccurate results. Tests had to be secretly run on traditional lab equipment. Errors were hidden. Data was manipulated. And employees who noticed these problems were told to stay silent or leave. Some tried to speak up. Most were ignored. Others were threatened. Because here's the uncomfortable truth: Theranos didn't survive because nobody knew. It survived because knowing was inconvenient. This leads us to the promise that Silicon Valley quietly makes to itself: fake it till you make it. At first glance, it sounds harmless. Encourage confidence. Sell the vision. Build momentum before perfection. But Theranos exposed the dark side of that philosophy. When pretending becomes policy and success is measured by fundraising instead of functionality, the line between ambition and fraud begins to blur. And once that line disappears, anything becomes justifiable in the name of progress. Elizabeth Holmes didn't need to convince everyone. She only needed to convince enough people with enough power to keep the story alive. And she did. Investors poured in money. Media outlets repeated the narrative. Awards were given. Magazine covers were printed. The more visible Theranos became, the harder it was to stop, because stopping would mean admitting that everyone involved had failed to do their job. This is the second loop. Reputation, lock in. Once people invest not just money, but identity into a story, walking away becomes psychologically painful. Doubt feels like betrayal. Evidence feels like an attack. And critics are dismissed as negative, jealous, or incapable of understanding innovation. The system becomes not because the lie is strong, but because the truth is socially dangerous. Meanwhile, real patients were affected. Faulty test results were delivered. Medical decisions were made based on incorrect data. Lives were put at risk. But these consequences stayed hidden behind non-disclosure agreements, legal threats, and the overwhelming force of narrative control. The story of Theranos was too big to fail. Until it was senti. The collapse didn't come from investors. It didn't come from the board. It came from journalists who refused to accept vague answers, and engineers who couldn't live with the lie anymore. Once the curtain was pulled back, the illusion collapsed quickly. The technology never worked. It never came close. The company was built on deception. Elizabeth Holmes was eventually convicted of fraud. And just like that, the story shifted from visionary to villain, from genius to criminal. But here's the most important part. The system that created Theranos didn't disappear. It learned, it adjusted, it moved on, because Theranos wasn't an anomaly. It was a stress test. And Silicon Valley passed it by proving something terrifying. You don't need working technology to build $1 billion company. You need belief, momentum, and silence. You need a culture that punishes skepticism and rewards optimism at all costs. You need people who are afraid to say, this doesn't work. That's why this story matters far beyond one woman or one company. The same mechanics appear again and again in failed startups, in crypto projects, in AI platforms, in companies promising revolutionary results without transparency. The language changes. The technology changes. The psychology doesn't. And this brings us to the final loop. The question everyone asks after a scandal like this isn't, how did this happen? It's, how did nobody stop it? The answer is uncomfortable, because stopping it would have required people to risk their status, their access, their reputation, and their sense of belonging. And most systems are designed to make that risk feel unacceptable. Elizabeth Holmes didn't trick Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley enabled her. It rewarded her confidence, amplified her story, and ignored her failures until ignoring them became impossible. And that's why similar stories will continue to appear, because the incentives haven't changed. Only the characters have. So the next time you hear about a revolutionary product that can't be explained, a founder who discourages questions, or a company that asks for trust before proof, remember this story, because Theranos wasn't just a lie. It was a warning. And the scariest part is that the conditions that allowed it to thrive are still here, quietly shaping the next billion-dollar issue. If understanding how these systems work matters to you, if you want to recognize these patterns before they collapse, then stay with this channel. Because the next Theranos is already being built, and this time, the story will sound even better.